gentlemen, President Abraham Lincoln.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Nice weather we're having, isn't it? This is nice. Well, I bring greetings to all of you from Washington City and your two senators, Zachariah Chandler and Jacob Howard. Now, I must confess that I'm not on the best of terms with Chandler. He often thinks he's the biggest toad in the puddle. But I am rather fond of Jacob Howard. It's because of his work that I can stand before you here today and say thank God for Michigan a second time. Now, the first time was 4 years ago when Michigan troops marched into Washington City to help protect the Capitol. They were the first troops from the West to come in, and when I received that news, I said, thank God for Michigan, because then I knew the Western states would help support the cause of preserving the Union. 2 years ago, I issued a proclamation freeing the slaves in the rebel states. I wanted that to be a permanent law. Now, it's taken 2 years, but I'm pleased to say that Congress has finally passed a bill abolishing slavery in this country, and that bill is now in the hands of the states, and if it is approved, it'll become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and we will have slavery in this country no more forever. Your Senator, Jacob Howard, wrote that bill. So, on that, I can say thank God for Michigan a second time. Yes, give that, you can be very proud of that man. Indeed, Jacob Howard, remember that name. Well, a short time ago, some folks were asking me questions about Gettysburg. And, you know, I made a little speech there. I almost didn't go. Our boy Tad was ill with the fever, same fever that killed his brother the year before. And he would take his medicine only from me. And so his mother thought that I should stay home and tend to Tad, do my fatherly duty. But in my mind, I had my duty to the country. I needed to go to Gettysburg to make that speech. And so I did. Now, I received the invitation about 2 weeks beforehand from David Wills, who was chairman of the committee. And he invited me to come up to Gettysburg to make a few appropriate remarks dedicating the cemetery for its sacred purpose. And I replied that I would be pleased to be there, provided my schedule allowed it. And I began thinking in my mind what I wanted to say. About 3 days or so before the actual event, I made the decision to go for certain, and a special train was arranged to transport us up there. It's a 6-hour journey. I had most of the speech written on Executive Mansion stationery before we left. And I remember there was a Union officer that came by the Executive Mansion to escort me over to the train depot, transport us up to Gettysburg. Well, the train was scheduled to leave about noon. Well, I had a busy schedule and I had things to do, and this officer was getting nervous because noon had come and we were still at the Executive Mansion. And I said to him, "You remind me of the condemned man who was riding in the wagon on the way to the gallows. Folks were rushing by to get to the scene of the hanging. And he yelled out, 'No need to hurry, folks. The fun won't start till I get there.' And sure enough, that train did not leave without us. We made the 6-hour journey up to Gettysburg, and I shall never forget, when we got off the train and stepped onto the platform, there were stacks of empty coffins waiting to receive the remains of those men and boys who had sacrificed their lives the previous July when 90,000 Federals did battle against about 75,000 rebel forces over 3 days. When it was all finished, over 50,000 casualties, over 50,000 men and boys lay dead and dying and missing. It was hot those 3 days. The reports that I received said the temperature was in the 90s. And some fields had so many bodies that you could walk from one end to the other and never touch the ground. Well, in all that heat, something had to be done with those bodies. And so large, shallow graves were dug and the bodies thrown in and covered up with soil. Well, then the rains came, washed away some of that soil. Animals came out of the forest and dug up some of those graves, and, well, you could use your imagination. It was not a nice place to be. There was a stench in the air that it was hardly fit to breathe. Water in some places was unfit to drink. And something needed to be done. Well, in government, when we're not sure quite what to do, we establish a committee to decide what to do. And the decision was made that rather than send all those bodies back to the 18 states from whence they came, we'd establish a national cemetery there in Gettysburg, the first one. And land was purchased on Cemetery Hill right next to the city cemetery. And bids were let to decide who was going to get the job of transferring those bodies. The winning bid was $1.59 a body, and the work was begun. And it was a slow, tedious process of identifying all those bodies and determining which outfit they were with, and so that they could know, because they were all buried by state and so on. Well, so now here it is. Well, then the committee decided that there should be a ceremony to dedicate the cemetery. And they all agreed they wanted Edward Everett to be the orator that day, famous man from Boston. And they had set October the 23rd as the date for the ceremony. But in Everett's reply, he said he needed more time to write his speech, and he'd be happy to accept the invitation if they would move it back to November the 19th. Well, they wanted him, so they moved the date. So the date was set. So here it is, the evening of the 18th, we're in Gettysburg, and I receive a telegraph message from Mrs. Lincoln reporting that Tad's fever broke. He was out of danger, and I needn't worry. Well, that allowed me to put my attention to writing the final paragraph of my speech. The next morning, there was a procession out to the cemetery. And it was difficult because there were a lot of people in town. Now, Gettysburg is a town of about 2,400 souls. And some said there were about 15,000 people in town that day. And normally we ride in carriages in a procession, but with all the people, we had to ride horseback. Well, someone made the decision that I could ride a small horse. My feet were dragging on the ground. Well, somebody saw fit to find a big chestnut horse, and that did the job a whole lot better. Well, we got out to the cemetery, mounted the speaker's platform, which was set up in the city cemetery, and the ceremony began with a prayer that thought it was a speech. It was a long one. And then Edward Everett was introduced to the crowd, and he got up and he spoke, and he spoke, and he spoke some more. Nearly 2 hours later, he sat down, and the audience applauded. And my Secretary of State, William Seward, was seated beside me, and I turned to him and I said, "Now, Billy, are they applauding because he made a good speech or because they're glad he's finished?" The United States Marine Band was there, played a special hymn written for the occasion, and then I was introduced to the crowd, and I rose up from my chair that I was sitting in, stepped to the front of the platform and looked over that massive crowd of about 15,000 people, and took the speech out of my pocket and I spoke these words that day. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is, rather, for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause to which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. Well, we'll be yonder over there if anyone has questions. Or I see a few people pointing cannons at us. It always makes me nervous when they point a cannon at me and say, "Smile, I'm going to shoot you."
But at least you're not in the theater.
I love the theater.
But you're out in the right theater.
Too soon?
Well, there's several to choose from. So thank you for your kind attention here this morning.